Visual cues are very important in our lives, and they can shape how we think and even how we act. The fact that Jewish people have often been portrayed negatively or in a demeaning way in Christian art is an indication of how we Christians have been influenced in our thinking about Jewish people and about Jewish religious practice and observance. Our seminar today would not have been possible, would not have even been imagined if it were not for Nostra Aetate in our times, the document of the Second Vatican Council. And Nostra Aetate would never have been written had it not been for the attempt by the Nazi powers to eliminate the Jewish people. The horrors of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, have made us begin to see differently. During the Second Vatican Council, the realization of a long history of the teaching of contempt of the Jewish people, especially within Christian Europe, was somehow recognized. Nostra Aetate began as a document on the Catholic Church's relationship to the Jewish people, and it developed during the Second Vatican Council to become a document on the Catholic Church's relationship with people of all faiths. Today, we look at some of our Christian art through post-Vatican II eyes. My hope is that this viewing will help us Christians to see the long history during which we often portray Jews in a subordinate manner. Allied to this hope is a belief that we can and will take greater care about how we portray Jews, and indeed how we portray all people who are not within our own circle, that we learn to portray people with a great empathy. To lead us in our seminar today, we have Dr. Claire Renkin, an art historian. Claire has a PhD in art history from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey in the US. She has degrees in English and art history from La Trobe University and from the University of Massachusetts. During the 1990s, she lectured in art history at the University of Massachusetts. Since 2001, she returned to Australia and has lectured in art history and spirituality at Yarra Theological Union within the University of Divinity. Here, she teaches courses on art and spirituality, and especially the spirituality of Western Europe from late antiquity through to the early modern period. Her research and publications focus on visual imagery, on gender, and on female sanctity. With Anne Elvey, Carol Hogan, and Kim Power, she edited Reinterpreting the Eucharist, Explorations in Feminist Theology and Ethics. Claire is currently head of the Department of Christian Thought and History at Yarra Theological Union. And so it is with great joy that I hand over to Claire to lead us in this exploration.
Thank you very much. From the time of the early church, fathers viewed Jews as crippled and defective because of their rejection of Christ. The assumption was that the Jewish people should have accepted Christ, a doctrine known as Supersessionism. For example, Paul in Romans chapter 9 interprets the story of Jacob and Esau as an allegory of the relationship between the church and the synagogue. The elder shall be servant to the younger. In other words, Judaism as a religious tradition had been superseded by Christianity and should disappear as a distinct entity. In this schema, although the Hebrew scriptures recounted the history of God's relationship to the original chosen people, Christians insisted that the incarnation had supplanted this link. Thus, both the laws and the stories contained in Hebrew scripture had become redundant. However valuable in its era, Judaism was now relegated to being a precursor or forerunner of a new era. To confirm this contention, Paul reminds his readers of the story of Jacob and Esau, in which the eldest, Esau, gives up his rights as the firstborn to his younger brother Jacob. Consequently, the elder becomes a servant of the younger, as should now happen to Jews. For Paul and subsequent Christian thinkers like St. Augustine, Judaism had played an indispensable role in early Christian history. Judaism, the elder child, now cast into the shadow by a younger sibling, became a living witness to the prehistory of the church. The Jewish people had safeguarded the Hebrew scriptures, not for themselves, but above all for the benefit of Christians, a role that was now obsolete. The images I shall present start with a 9th century example that accords a certain parity to synagoga and ecclesia. Unfortunately, as you all know, from the 12th century onward, this balanced relationship gave way to fear of the other and eventually to vicious caricatures of Jewish people. That is the sad story that this presentation must tell. Paired personifications of ecclesia and synagoga, pictorial means to convey the idea of harmony between the Old and New Testament, first appeared in Christian art during the 9th century, as we see on these two examples. These depictions, as we see, suggest a more positive relationship. The figures of ecclesia and synagoga were understood as two rival queens in dispute over their authority. Ecclesia occupies the privileged position at Christ's right hand, where the chalice she holds receives the blood pouring from Christ's side. Opposite her, synagoga faces Christ while she has a firm grip of a standard by her side. Although she turns to depart, her pose could also suggest defiance. From the early 13th century, a change in the relationship between ecclesia and synagoga emerged, in which the triumph of Christianity over Judaism became the dominant message. In bustling urban settings, new anxiety about the status of Jews in Christian society emerged. Visual images became increasingly defamatory from the 11th century. Large, over life-sized sculptural depictions of ecclesia and synagoga on the portals of cathedrals built in the 12th and 13th century became familiar throughout Europe. Only now, the defeat of synagoga by her rival took on a more dramatic visual aspect. And we're seeing on the right, these are the original 13th century sculptures which were removed from the facade of the Strasbourg Cathedral in the latter half of the last century. The figures we see now are casts. We see synagogue's figure. Her downcast glance signals her defeat by the victorious ecclesia. Her blindfolded eyes signal her ignorance of Christ, and the staff of her standard leans broken against her body. The tablet of law appears to be slipping from her fingers. Synagogue remains beautiful. Her naturalistic figure and elegantly draped form a reminder to the contemporary viewer of her part in the Christian story. Only now she appears as the docile, obsolete elder who shall serve the younger. In the following centuries, the portrayal of Synagoga stressed her defeat and submission to triumphant ecclesia, as we see in this miniature from a German Bible from the first half of the 15th century. Synagoga's crown falls from her head, and her standard is broken in several pieces. By this time, the juxtaposition of ecclesia and synagogue had acquired even more negative connotations. Unmistakably, this association between the Jews and the devil could not be more explicit, as we see in this example where the grotesque demon torments synagogue. The devastating impact of such defamatory and corrosive visual imagery over time in the Christian audiences of such works cannot be overstated. Visual images reflected and in turn shaped Western European Christians' religious and cultural attitudes to Jews and Judaism over hundreds of years. It is only in the last 60 years that Christians have begun to systematically address and correct the odious theological and cultural lies and caricatures that formerly characterized much of Christianity's, including Catholic representations of Jews and Judaism. For Catholics, and indeed for all humans, the document which Mary has referred to, known as Nostra Aetate, or In Our Time, released at the Second Vatican Council in October 1965, proclaimed a new vision of the theological relationship between Judaism and Christianity. Not only did this path-breaking document reject centuries-old formulations, but it condemned all forms of anti-Semitism, both Christian and secular. As you know, the document asserted the eternal nature of God's covenant with the Hebrew people. By proclaiming Christians' belief in the bond between God and the Jews, God's chosen people, the Church firmly renounced the teaching that the coming of Christianity, a new covenant, replaced that with the Jews. This proclamation has particular significance in regard to the legacy of the visual images of Ecclesia and Synagoga. Here, the Catholic Church, in effect, repudiated the supersessionist conception of Judaism's relationship to Christianity. Instead of the triumphalist belief that the coming of Christ supplanted God's covenant with Israel, the Catholic Church acknowledged and proclaimed Judaism as an older sibling and not a defeated rival. So let's look at some ways in which Nostra Aetate has altered depictions of Jews in Christian art. Recently, to mark the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, the Catholic University of St. Joseph's in Philadelphia commissioned this bronze, which we're looking at on the right of this slide, sculpture to mark the landmark statement. The work, entitled Synagoga and Ecclesia in Our Time, and that reversal, I think, is a very pointed example of this rethinking of the traditional relationship. This attempts, and I think successfully, reformulates this traditional theme. While the sculpture incorporates the familiar iconographic features such as the female figures, the crowns, the Torah, and the book, he proposes a wholly different relationship between the two figures. In choosing to pose the women seated and close to each other, Synagoga and Ecclesia appear now as equals who acknowledge each other's sacred scripts, perhaps even as partners. Cascading drapery folds create a visual energy that evokes a dynamic interaction between the two protagonists. In contrast to the allegorical figures we have been discussing, I pass now to narratives from the Christian scriptures. In our first example, familiar to you from the flyer for this lecture, The crucial point is that this image does not in any way disparage or defame Jews or the Jewish people. The altarpiece, painted by the Sienese artist Ambrogio Lorenzetti for Siena's cathedral, depicts the narrative known as the presentation in the temple. The story, based on Luke chapter 2, combines two different narratives, that of the presentation of Jesus in the temple 30 days after his birth, and that of the subsequent purification of the Virgin 40 days after childbirth. The subject was popular in Italian and North European art during the Middle Ages and beyond. What I want to focus on is a fascinating detail of the women's costume. In this detail, you can see that the Virgin and one of her female attendants both wear earrings. At this time, in central and northern Italy, earrings had ceased to be worn by Christian women several centuries earlier. Women in Sicily and other parts of southern Italy still prize their earrings, perhaps a reflection of a continuing taste for the costume and jewelry of the more exotic East. However, in northern Italy, Jewish women wore earrings. Contemporary 14th century viewers of Ambrogio's paintings would have identified the women's sumptuous earrings and other features of the costumes, like the elaborately decorated borders of the mantles, as you can see here, as expressions of an earlier style and taste. This taste reflected the well-known luxury of Byzantium. The historian Diane Owen Hughes, in an oft-cited article, argued that Lorenzetti, by portraying the Virgin wearing earrings, was emphasizing her Jewishness precisely because only Jewish women continued to wear such jewelry. Interestingly, Italian cities in the 15th century introduced laws that mandated the wearing of earrings by all Jewish women over the age of 10. These statutes reflect a discriminatory mandate which had its legitimation in a canon issued at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. And I quote from this document: "In some provinces, the dress of Jews and Saracens distinguishes them from Christians, but in others, a degree of confusion has arisen, so that they cannot be recognized by any distinguishing marks. As a result, in error, Christians have sexual intercourse with Jewish or Saracen women, and Jews or Saracens have sexual intercourse with Christian women. In order that the crime of such an accursed mingling shall not in future have an excuse and an evasion under the pretext of error, we resolve that Jews and Saracens of both sexes in all Christian lands shall distinguish themselves publicly from other people by their dress. According to the testimony of Scripture, such a precept was already made by Moses." End of quote. From the 13th century, the prescription of special dress became a defensive measure throughout Western Europe. When political, economic, or religious crisis erupted in which Jews and their communities became targets, this canon of the Lateran Council provided an effective weapon to stigmatize and isolate Jews. Spurred on by the preaching campaigns of the friars throughout the urban areas, city rulers legislated to require Jewish men to wear distinctive items of clothing. Often the statutes referred vaguely to a special sign. Occasionally, cities prescribed a circle to be sewn onto the chest of either red or yellow material of a man's clothing. For women, the distinguishing sign became earrings or a veil. What may have motivated these campaigns to stigmatize Jews? Without citing specific cases, we know that in many communes of late medieval Italy, Christians and Jews not only lived together in reasonable harmony, without marked signs of difference in dress, to the point where in some cities Jews were able to claim citizenship. What may have upset this relative harmony? The answer reflects no credit on overly zealous preachers from the Franciscan and Dominican mendicant orders. These preachers, including the widely travelled observant Franciscans, St. Bernardino of Siena and St. John Capistrano. In this painting, depicting St. John Capistrano preaching, in the upper left corner, we see a Jewish man being manhandled into listening to the preacher's attempts to convert him. Among their exhortations on how to lead a holy life, we know that regrettably, the friars urged citizens to shun the company of their Jewish neighbours and friends. At all costs, Christians were to avoid the supposed disgrace of impurity that mingling with Jews would allegedly bring to a cleansed Christian community. As an art historian of Christian imagery, it pains me to have to show you how, in the following decades in both Italy and Northern Europe, visual images, particularly woodcuts, played a pernicious part in persuading viewers to believe grotesque lies and defamatory accusations against Jews and Judaism. Throughout Europe, rulers and town councils enacted these wearing of signs to distinguish Christians from Jews. The laws were enforced with varying degrees of severity. However, by the late Middle Ages, altarpieces that populated churches from Spain to Germany housed paintings and other objects like manuscripts, which featured scenes replete with anti-Jewish imagery. Undoubtedly, the most virulent examples of these offensive marks of identification are the Judenringel or Rota, and the grotesque physiognomic facial features such as broad heads, bulbous or hooked noses, bulging eyes, and generally beast-like facial features. We can trace these odious signifiers to the 13th and 14th centuries throughout Europe, as we see here in this scene on the right from an early 14th century manuscript that recounts the long-term history of France. Let me draw your attention to two elements of this scene, both of which unambiguously identify figures as Jewish. The first is the circle that several of the men wear. This shape, from as early as the 13th century, became a widely prescribed sign Jewish men were ordered to fix to their outer garment. This, in fact, is the Judenringel or the Rota I referred to. The second and more offensive sign is a man who in profile appears with a pronounced hooked nose. This early appearance of what would become a familiar caricature of Jewish male identity would continue to have a long career in European visual arts. Scandalously, Christian narratives quickly adopted this latter grotesque sign. The ease with which this corrosive visual slander entered European Christian visual culture cannot be overstated. And as we see here in this folio from a manuscript dating from the mid-13th century, you can see the page is divided into two self-contained scenes. In the upper half, we see a narrative of the scene of Judas being paid the silver in order to betray Christ. What I want you to notice here is the figure of Judas. Here, the figure of the high priest, and behind the high priest, who's holding the bag of money, is a devil, making a very clear point that it is the evil, the temptation is the work of the devil. What I want you to notice is the grotesque physiognomy, the grotesque distortion of the Jewish men's profile. Notice how this mimics the profile of the devil, making the clear connection between the evil through their physiognomic features. And here in a second scene, this is based on a traditional story It goes back to about the 8th century, and it tells how a monk, Theophilus, wants to enter into a bargain. He wants to sell his soul to the devil so that he will be offered ecclesiastical preferment. In order to do this, he has to, of course, be able to make contact with the devil. And so he enlists the help of a Jewish sorcerer. And here we see the Jewish sorcerer standing behind Theophilus, who is in fact presenting Theophilus to the devil as they make their bargain. Again, I want to draw your attention to the features of the Jewish sorcerer, who's identified by his hat, as we saw these figures, the Jewish figures up here, but also notice again that distorted caricature of his facial features, and again the visual similarities to those of the devil. The narrative of Christ's passion during the late Middle Ages took on even greater prominence during this period. Under the influence of a spirituality that focused on the humanity of Christ, scenes of Christ's suffering before and at the crucifixion became ever more visually graphic. These panels from a winged altarpiece are dated to around 1410 and are attributed to a painter active in the Middle Rhine area. At first glance, the two scenes, on the left, the scourging of Christ, and on the right, the crowning of thorns, appear as routine renderings of the scriptural narratives. But let's look a little closer. In the scene of the scourging, notice the figure who holds the ropes which bind Christ's hands. In contrast to the other tormentors, he has an inscription appear on his left shoulder. The pseudo-Hebrew characters identify him as a Jew. Other signs confirm this. The round hat with the pointed shaft on top and the yellow colour of his dress were all familiar and widely disseminated Christian signs of Jewish identity. The scene of the crown of thorns similarly links the identity of the tormentors of Christ to Jews. Only in this scene, all four brutes are depicted as Jews. The headgear of each figure signals this to the viewer. This is not the only message that the contemporary medieval viewer would have drawn from these paintings. By emphasizing the supposedly collective nature of the tormentors' actions, such works of art promoted the terrible libel promoted by the church, that is, the collective guilt of the Jews for the death of Christ. Derek Bagart, whose painting we see now on this screen, painted this panel of the carrying of the cross around the 1490s. He based his idea for the work on earlier prints of this subject by German artists. Bagart explores the casual brutality of the soldiers escorting Christ to his execution. The long-standing belief that physical ugliness signified wickedness functions here to underline the thuggish behaviour of the soldiers. The almost cartoonish caricatures of the four most prominent soldiers allow the viewer to identify the men as Jews. And the figures I'm referring to point out with the arrow, these figures here. Familiar stereotypical features like broad heads, protruding lips, bulbous noses, and puffy eyes form a visual checklist of qualities of the enemies of Christ. Only now, the narrative is located in a setting that recalls a contemporary German townscape, and figures wearing costumes that are of the period. By inserting familiar contemporary details into the biblical narrative, these scenes take on a vivid immediacy in which the distant past haunts the present world of the viewer. The persuasive force of such visual rhetoric helped stoke the flames of anti-Semitism. The visual images we have explored in sculpture, manuscript illuminations, or paintings undoubtedly framed and nurtured religious and cultural attitudes and ideologies of the communities in whose cities and towns these objects were displayed. Such influence, though powerful, was in the main local. The advent of printing in the mid-15th century changed this irrevocably. The emergence of the woodcut and print put visual images into the hands of a much larger market. Where paintings, sculpture, and illuminated manuscripts had formerly only been affordable for nobles and wealthy emerging classes, prints now reached a much broader social audience. Although some artists like Dürer commanded hefty prices for his prints, many other artists made a lucrative living in feeding a market hungry for cheap woodcuts. Often these works were purchased as souvenirs of a pilgrimage or as devotional aids, just as printed pamphlets and broadsheets played a critical role in spreading news of political events, disasters, or seemingly supernatural occurrences. Prints likewise disseminated visually religious ideas. Many artists produced cycles of the life of Christ together with cycles of the Passion. These prints circulated widely throughout Europe, reinforcing and legitimizing virulent anti-Jewish stereotypes. The Swiss artist whose work we see before us, Urs Graf, was a contemporary of Dürer. He established a successful career as a printmaker, goldsmith, and mercenary. He supplied designs to printers in Paris, Basel, and Strasbourg. The four examples we see, all woodcuts, formed part of a Passion cycle. The scenes feature exterior settings of landscape and urban environments. In both types, Graf evokes familiar features of contemporary German-speaking lands. Graf's fascination with the brutality and demonic glee of the crowds features throughout this cycle. The artist relies on familiar facial caricature to associate bestial behavior with the Jewish identity. The full repertoire finds expression: profiles of men with sharply etched hook noses, leering smirks, bulbous jowls, and protruding eyes. Costume also plays a role in these defamatory labels. The Jewish hat with a truncated funnel, exotic turbans, and heavily brocaded capes and hoods that identify the Jewish high priests. In the foreground at right, in the woodcut depicting the scene known as the Ecce Homo, that is the presentation of Christ to the crowd, the portly older man wears the unmistakable sign of Jewish identity, the Judenringel. My final example takes us to late 15th century Trent, a city in the North Italian Alps that lies at the crossroads of travel between Italy and Northern Europe. This confected tale alleges that at Easter 1475, a Christian boy, Simon of Trent, was murdered by Jews, supposedly to obtain Christian blood for the Jewish Passover. This outrageous invention was, as you know, one of all too many such libels. This one was aided by the insidious promotion of the tale through the use of graphic prints to disseminate the false claims among a wide audience. Simon, the 2-year-old son of a poor tanner, goes missing on Holy Thursday. His father searches for him without success. After further searches, supported by the retinue of the Prince Bishop Johannes Hindenburg, the boy's body is found on the night of Easter Sunday in a sewer that passed beneath the houses of the Jewish community. The leader of the community, Samuel, immediately reports the discovery that night. Suspicion quickly settled on the Jews, and 6 men were arrested. A further 14 Jews were arrested, and after confessing under torture, were executed between June 1475 and January 1476. The remaining members of the Jewish community were expelled from the city. Undoubtedly, the following events escalated the mood of retribution against the Jewish community. Immediately after the discovery of the young boy's body, the personal physician to the Prince Bishop performed an autopsy on the child's body. His report noted how Simon's body had been punctured with pincers and bled to death. Only 1 day after recovering the child's body, the Prince Bishop arranged for Simon's corpse to be displayed on an altar in the Church of St. Peter's. And it is this scene from a carved altarpiece that we see referenced in this scene to the left of this slide. This other painting is what's known as a votive painting. Here we have a knight in the foreground, and above he's being protected by the Virgin and Child and the figure of Simon of Trent. Now, this is a painting made within less than 20 years after the events. This gives you some idea of the popularity of this scene, especially in visual images. Within 3 days, reports of miracles followed, which were recorded in a miracle book. As mentioned earlier, such alleged crimes had, since the 12th century, become the stuff of legend in England, France, as well as Germany. Like the related allegation of host desecration, these alleged crimes represent a grotesque Christian reenactment of Christ's passion. The innocent child, and it is always a male child, becomes a substitute for Christ's suffering. What sets apart the tale of Simon of Trent is the speed with which the incident became known throughout Europe. The role of Prince proved critical to the success of the propaganda efforts of the Prince Bishop to promote the story and thus further the cause for the canonization of Simon. Quite literally, within days of the boy's death, the Prince Bishop commissioned paintings of scenes of the boy's death and martyrdom. By September 1475, a letter written in Latin by the physician Johannes Martius Tiberinus appeared in a pamphlet accompanied by 13 woodcuts depicting the events of the alleged murder. These woodcuts by Albert Kuhner, which we will see in the following slides, claimed the status of eyewitness news. Print culture, as I have noted, asserted the status of Prince as authentic visual testimony to the veracity of the image depicted. The selection of scenes to accompany Tiberius's testimony enlarge upon the event itself of the alleged murder by including scenes portraying Jews assembled in the synagogue and gathering at the Passover meal. Viewers are persuaded to read the scenes of the alleged torture and murder as equally based on authentic description. In other words, all the woodcuts are a reliable visual record. As well as a pamphlet featuring text and woodcuts, the production of numerous other images, including single-leaf prints, circulated widely in Germany and Italy. This example from a German woodblock around 1475 to 1480 may have been created as part of the pilgrimage industry that sprung up around the defamatory tale. As you see, small images of a child made of wax and various body parts hung from a beam. These items are almost certainly ex-votos, objects which pilgrims left behind in thanks for miraculous cures. Records relate that Hinderbach, the Prince Bishop, ordered some of the sites associated with the alleged murder to be converted into devotional sites, which would be part of a pilgrimage visit. The home of Samuel, the leader of the Jewish community, was quickly converted into a chapel. The newsworthiness of the tale is further evidenced by this woodcut based on a design by the artist Michael Wohlgemuth. The image appeared in the famous Nuremberg Chronicle, printed in 1493, a chronicle of world history interpreted through the lens of biblical events. The print shares the page with text, by this time a standard layout in illustrated books. Note how, in Wohlgemuth's interpretation of the event, he inserts visual signs calculated to underscore familiar Jewish stereotypes. The circular patch fixed to the men's garments, exaggerated facial features, including the hook nose, and in anecdotal detail, I have not yet discussed the prominent money bag, an allusion to the legitimate role of Jews as moneylenders in a society where Christians could not charge interest. No less interesting is the inclusion of names above the figures to identify them. We saw inscriptions also in the Kuna woodcuts. In both examples, the naming of the alleged culprits underlines the documentary status of the image. Devotion to Simon of Trent continued to flourish into the early modern era. In 1588, the Pope beatified the boy, an event which spurred new commissions for paintings and sculptures, including these two altarpieces, which we see here, both painted around the 16th and 17th centuries. These two medallions were sculpted by Francesco Orodini around 1750. The reliefs decorate the facade of a building built on the site of the house of Samuel, the leader of the Jewish community in Trent. The feast day of Simon continued to be celebrated in Trent and other North Italian cities. The annual procession held in Trent to mark the feast day of the Blessed Simon was a popular event in the 19th and 20th centuries. The release by the Vatican of the document Nostra Aetate in 1965 led to the official suppression of the Feast of Simon of Trent. Paintings were removed from altars, chapels closed, and plaques erected to record the terrible libels and persecution of Trent's Jewish community. Local attempts to present the history of the appalling episode include the current exhibition of artworks held in the Diocesan Museum, featuring objects associated with the story of the alleged murder. And here I show you the poster for the exhibition. Actually, you'll notice that the dates, because the exhibition fell during the pandemic in Italy, it was postponed, and I think the exhibition actually finished only last week. You'll notice I've included the translation of the title of the exhibition, The Invention of the Culprit, The Case of Simon of Trent, from propaganda to history, obviously suggests a far more critical interpretation of the history of this sad story. Many of the works exhibited had not been on display since the mid-1960s. The Pope's order in 1965 that the cult of Blessed Simon be suppressed appears, at least on the surface, to have been much more successful than a similar order made by his forerunner, Pope Sixtus IV, in 1482. Upon learning of the accusations against the Jews of Trent in 1475, the Pope was immediately suspicious. He ordered an investigation into the murder and prohibited a continuation of the trial. He attempted to curb the emerging cult by forbidding the execution of any paintings of the murdered boy. The official he sent to investigate faced the hostility of the local leaders, who made his task impossible. Indeed, the Roman investigator's safety would have been in jeopardy. In the event, the trial went ahead. The Prince-Bishop was cleared of any wrongdoing, and the bishop, as we know, disregarded the Pope's ban on commissioning paintings of the image of Simon. Realpolitik and local power structures prevailed against the Pope in far-off Rome. My presentation has moved all too rapidly over hundreds of years of what can only be described as an appalling history in which Christians propagated utterly vile examples of anti-Semitic slander and stereotypes. We often hear people dismiss such offensive images with a belittling phrase like, "Oh, it's just a painting." I contend to the contrary, that visual images exert enormous power, often in unnoticed or even insidious ways. Graphic propaganda, such as I have shown you, can unleash the most terrible consequences. Indeed, these images may be called not just offensive, but dangerous. I am showing these three final images. We know that the magisterium has officially suppressed anti-Semitic cults, such as those of Simon of Trent, or of a similar figure, St. Werner of Oberwesel. The latter is depicted here in these three stained glass windows. Nevertheless, the official repudiation has not prevented local devotees in the German Rhineland and in the Netherlands from sponsoring devotional images that seem to celebrate the ancient slanders of the Jews. We here today must express our bewilderment and horror that no policy, however well-intentioned, seems able to stifle the re-emergence of the age-old lies. On that sorry note, I want to thank you for your attention to this deeply upsetting subject. Thank you.